April 1940. A German checkpoint outside Oslo. A Nazi commander shoves a Luger pistol into the driver's window of a civilian truck. The engine is idling, a rough mechanical cough in the freezing air. The driver isn't a soldier, he isn't a spy, he is an engineer named Fredrik Haslund. He is wearing a heavy wool coat that smells of damp earth and stale tobacco. He adjusts his round spectacles, looking more like a man late for a site inspection than a fugitive. But in the back of his truck, hidden under a few dirty tarps, is 50 tons of gold bullion. If the German officer walks around the back and lifts that canvas, the war is effectively over. Hitler gets the gold. The Norwegian resistance dies before it begins. The nation ceases to exist as a sovereign power. Haslund has no gun. He has no backup. He has 26 trucks behind him, filled with farmers and taxi drivers who are sweating through their shirts, waiting for a signal. Haslund does the only thing he can do. He looks at the Luger, then up at the officer's face. He hands over a piece of paper he typed himself, a manifest that means absolutely nothing. And then he smiles. He smiles like a man who has nothing to hide. He smiles like a man delivering potatoes or machine parts, not the entire financial heart of a kingdom. The officer looks at the paper. He looks at the trucks. He waves them through. The gears grind. The truck lurches forward, and Fredrik Haslund drives away from the checkpoint, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. What happens next is the greatest bank heist in human history. In the next 60 days, this civil servant will steal $40 billion from under the nose of the Luftwaffe. He will trick the entire German army without firing a single shot. This is the story of the man who bankrupted the Third Reich with a fishing boat. 3 days earlier, the world was different. It was quiet. Fredrik Haslund was the secretary of the Labour Party's parliamentary group, an engineer by trade, a man of logistics and paperclips. He had suffered from tuberculosis in his youth, leaving him with a constitution that wasn't built for war. He didn't know how to shoot. He didn't know how to command a platoon. He stamped documents. He organized meetings. Then came the sirens. April 9th, 4 a.m. The sky over Oslo tore open. The Luftwaffe had arrived. German cruisers were already entering the Oslo fjord, their guns trained on the sleeping city. The invasion was precise, mechanical, and terrifyingly fast. The Norwegian government was fleeing. The king was on a train north. But in the basement of the Bank of Norway, there was a problem, a 50-ton problem. The nation's gold reserves, bars, coins, sovereign wealth. If the Nazis took the capital, they took the vault. And if they took the vault, they could pay for their war for another decade. The Minister of Finance didn't call a general, he called Haslund. He needed someone who could solve an impossible math problem. How do you move 1,500 heavy crates and 39 barrels of coins out of a city that is being surrounded, with zero preparation and zero time? Haslund arrived at the bank while the air raid sirens were still screaming. He didn't have military transport. The army was in disarray. So he improvised. He walked out into the street and started flagging down civilians. He hired cattle trucks. He hired delivery vans. He hired taxis. He didn't tell them what they were carrying. He just told them it was vital for Norway. They started a bucket brigade. It wasn't soldiers in uniform. It was old men, students, bank clerks in their shirt sleeves. They passed the gold bar by bar, crate by crate, from the deep vaults up to the street level. Gold is heavy. It creates a specific kind of exhaustion. They moved fast, fueled by pure adrenaline. They cleared the vault by 1 p.m. Let's pause for a second and talk about the physics of what Haslund was actually trying to do. Most people hear 50 tons of gold and they think of a number on a piece of paper. They don't think about the axles. A standard 1940s civilian truck, a Ford V8 or a Chevrolet delivery van, was rated to carry maybe 1.5 tons of cargo. Haslund had 53 tons of metal. If you overload a truck with gold, the suspension doesn't just sag, it snaps. The tires explode. The engine block cracks under the strain of pulling that dead weight uphill on icy roads. Haslund wasn't just fighting the Germans, he was fighting gravity. He had to perform a rapid calculation on the fly. He split the convoy into loads of roughly 2 tons per vehicle. That meant every single truck was driving at its absolute mechanical breaking point. You could hear it in the engines. They were screaming in first gear, crawling up the valleys north of Oslo at 10 miles per hour. If one truck broke down, they couldn't just call a tow truck. A breakdown meant leaving 2 tons of the nation's wealth sitting in a snowbank while the Luftwaffe circled overhead. And then there was the human cost of the weight. The bucket brigade at the bank wasn't just passing parcels. A standard gold bar weighs about 12 kilograms. A crate of them weighs 40. Try lifting a 40-kilogram box of dead weight, then twisting your torso and passing it to the man next to you. Now do that 1/500 times. By the time the last crate was loaded, the men's hands were raw. Their backs were in spasms. Some of them were vomiting from pure physical exertion, but nobody stopped. Haslund walked the line, his wool coat flapping, reminding them that every crate was a school, a hospital, a future for their children. They weren't moving metal. They were lifting the country. At 1:30 p.m., the first German jackboots marched down Karl Johans Gate. They missed the gold by 30 minutes. Haslund was already on the road, watching the smoke of Oslo rise in his rearview mirror. The convoy was a snake of 26 vehicles, struggling up the icy roads toward Lillehammer. The code name for the cargo was the heavy luggage. It was an apt name. It wasn't just heavy in weight. It was the weight of the future. Haslund sat in the lead truck, constantly checking his map. He knew that German paratroopers were dropping all over the country. They were seizing railheads, bridges, crossroads. Every mile was a gamble. They reached Lillehammer, but the trains weren't ready. The gold had to be unloaded again. This is where the nightmare of logistics set in. You can't just leave 50 tons of gold on a train platform. It attracts attention. It attracts bombers. Haslund needed to hide it in plain sight. He went to the local chief of police. He needed men, but he couldn't ask for guards. Guards imply something valuable. He asked for laborers. He told the volunteers to bring spades and shovels. When the locals arrived, they saw the crates. They saw the weight. Haslund told them they were digging trenches. It was a lie, a bluff to keep the panic down. They moved the crates into the basement of the local bank, working through the night. At one point, they stopped for a meal at a local hotel. The crates were stacked in the hallway because there was nowhere else to put them. The men sat on the boxes, eating sandwiches, exhausted, their hands blistered. A waiter squeezed past, carrying a tray of coffee. He grunted at the effort of stepping over the boxes. He asked what was in them. Haslund didn't even look up from his sandwich. He adjusted his glasses and said, "Elastic bands." The waiter nodded and walked away. The Nazis were 2 miles down the road hunting for this exact shipment, and Haslund was hiding it with a joke about office supplies. But the Germans were closing in. The paratroopers were dropping closer to Lillehammer. The gold had to move again, this time to the coast. Haslund secured a train, but a train is a sitting duck for a Stuka dive bomber. You can see a steam engine from 20,000 feet. They had to travel at night, crawling through the darkness without lights. During the day, they had to vanish. At Romsdalshorn station, Haslund found the perfect hiding spot. He parked the train under a massive overhanging cliff. This was the terrifying reality of the ghost train. For days, they lived in a game of cat and mouse with the German Air Force. During the day, the train had to become invisible. Haslund ordered the engineer to reverse the locomotive into the shadow of the Romsdalshorn cliff face. The rock hung over them like a shield, blocking the view from above. But hiding a steam engine is impossible. It breathes. It smokes. They had to dampen the fires, keeping the pressure just high enough to move if they were spotted, but low enough that the smoke wouldn't give away their position. The men sat in the freezing boxcars, huddled next to the gold crates for warmth. They couldn't light fires. They couldn't smoke cigarettes outside. They spoke in whispers. Every time they heard the drone of a Heinkel bomber echoing off the fjord walls, 50 men would freeze. They would look up at the dark rock above them and pray. If a single bomb hit the track ahead of them, they were trapped. If a bomb hit the track behind them, they were trapped. They were sitting on a bomb of their own. Not explosives, but value. If the Germans realized what was in those boxcars, they wouldn't bomb the train. They would drop paratroopers on top of it. Haslund spent these hours pacing the tracks, checking the tarps. He knew that just 30 miles to the south, the German Fallschirmjäger, the elite paratroopers, had seized the Dombos railway junction. They were effectively cut off. The only way out was the single track leading to the coast at Åndalsnes, and the only time they could move was under the cover of a moonless night. When the sun finally set, the order came down the line. Move. The train lurched forward, running black. No headlights, no cabin lights. Just 100 tons of steel and gold hurtling through the pitch-black Norwegian tunnels, trusting that the track ahead hadn't been blown up 5 minutes ago. The screech of the wheels on the rails sounded like a scream in the silence of the valley. This wasn't logistics anymore. It was Russian roulette with a steam engine. The guard for this ghost train wasn't a platoon of commandos. It was a poet. Nordahl Grieg, the famous Norwegian writer, had joined Haslund's ragtag group. He carried a rifle and walked the length of the train, guarding the nation's soul. It was fitting, an engineer and a poet, protecting the gold from the fascists. They reached the port of Åndalsnes, but it was too hot. The Germans were bombing the docks into rubble. They pushed on to Molde, the city of roses. But Molde was burning. The Luftwaffe had firebombed the wooden town. The streets were corridors of flame. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on the trucks. This was the rendezvous point. The British were coming. The HMS Glasgow, a heavy cruiser, was slicing through the North Sea to rescue the king, the cabinet, and the gold. The loading began under fire. The king boarded. The government officials boarded. Haslund's men started swinging the crates onto the deck. But 50 tons is a lot of gold. It takes time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. The chaos on the Molde dock was absolute. The British cruiser HMS Glasgow was screaming to leave, its sirens wailing, its anti-aircraft guns pounding away at the Stukas diving out of the smoke. In the middle of this inferno, a crane operator, his hands shaking from the concussions of the bombs, swung a cargo net of gold coins too fast. The net smashed against the side of the pier. One of the heavy oak barrels splintered. It was like a scene from a pirate movie, but set in hell. Thousands of gold sovereign coins, pure, heavy, glittering gold, spilled out across the blackened wood of the dock. They rolled into the cracks between the planks. They tinkled as they bounced into the freezing water below. For a split second, the loading stopped. Human nature took over. Here was a fortune, loose on the ground. A dock worker bent down, his hand reaching for a handful of coins. Maybe he thought he could save them. Maybe he thought about his pocket. It didn't matter. Nordahl Grieg, the poet with the rifle, stepped forward. He didn't point the weapon at the man. He just put a hand on his shoulder. The air around them was thick with burning timber and cordite. Grieg looked at the spilled gold, then at the man, and said the words that defined the entire mission. Let it go. We are saving the nation, not the change. The worker straightened up. He looked at the gold one last time, then stepped over it to grab the next crate. They left the coins there, glittering in the light of the burning city, to be buried under the ash. That is the definition of discipline. When the building is burning, you save the children, not the silverware. Haslund saved the bars. He left the loose change for the Nazis to find in the ashes. The captain of the Glasgow made a calculation. He had the king. He had 32 tons of the gold. If he stayed any longer, his ship would be sunk, and the king would be dead. He gave the order to cast off. Haslund stood on the burning dock. He watched the massive gray hull of the cruiser pull away, disappearing into the smoke. He looked down at his feet. There were still 18 tons of gold sitting on the pier. 18 tons, enough to rebuild a city, enough to buy an army. And the British had just left him. The Germans were advancing from the south. The city behind him was an inferno. Most men would have run. Most men would have kicked a crate of gold into the sea and fled into the mountains. Fredrik Haslund adjusted his coat. He turned to the remaining men. He didn't panic. He looked at a local coastal steamer, a small passenger boat called the Driva. It wasn't a warship, it was a ferry. He said, "Load it." They manhandled the remaining 18 tons onto the wooden deck of the Driva. The captain of the ferry was terrified. He was a civilian. He didn't sign up to fight the German Navy. Haslund talked him into it. He used that calm, rational voice. He convinced him that this was the only way. They cast off, hugging the coast, trying to hide in the fjords. But the Luftwaffe has eyes everywhere. A German plane spotted the tiny steamer. It dove, machine guns chattering. Bullets tore through the wooden superstructure. A bomb exploded near the bow. The Driva was hit. She was taking on water. The captain had to beach her. They rammed the ship onto the shore of a remote fjord. Now the gold was stranded again, sitting in a wrecked ferry on a mudbank miles from nowhere. This is the moment where the story should have ended. A beached ship, a surrounded country, a hopeless situation. But Haslund was relentless. He looked at the local fishing fleet, small boats, cutters, vessels designed for catching herring, not outrunning the Kriegsmarine. Their names were Heimdall, Barden, Svanen, Leif, and Gudrun. They smelled of fish guts and diesel. Haslund gathered the fishermen. These were rough men, men of the sea. They knew the waters better than the Germans ever could. He told them what was in the crates. He told them what it meant. He split the gold between the 5 boats. It was a gamble. If one boat was caught, they wouldn't lose everything. They set sail north, heading for Tromsø, far inside the Arctic Circle. This was the final run, the gauntlet. They were sailing through waters infested with German U-boats and destroyers. They were chugging along at 8 knots, exposed, vulnerable. Haslund rowed on one of the boats, sitting on a crate of bullion, smoking cigarettes, watching the horizon. For days, they navigated the labyrinth of islands. They hid in coves during the day, covering the boats with branches and camouflage nets. At night, they made their run. It was a slow-motion chase, the might of the Nazi war machine against 5 fishing boats and an engineer, and they made it. They slipped into Tromsø harbor just as the HMS Enterprise arrived to meet them. They loaded the final 18 tons. Haslund stood on the deck of the British cruiser as it steamed west, toward England, toward safety. He had done it. He had moved 50 tons of gold across a country at war, using trucks, trains, ferries, and fishing boats. He had lost exactly 297 coins, dropped in the water during the frantic loading. That was it. Everything else was safe. The gold was sent to the Bank of Canada in Ottawa. It sat in a vault there for the rest of the war. It was used to fund the Norwegian government in exile. It paid for the weapons, the training, the pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain. It paid for the resistance. That gold was the lifeblood of a free Norway, kept pumping by a man who had never fired a gun. Fredrik Haslund didn't return to Norway as a conqueror. He didn't lead a parade. When the war ended, he went back to his life. He went back to engineering, to politics, to the quiet work of rebuilding a nation. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He died in 1950, just 5 years after the liberation. He was a quiet man, a man of wool coats and round glasses, a man who proved that you don't need to be a soldier to defeat an empire. You just need a clipboard, a fake manifest, and the audacity to smile when a gun is pointed at your face.